global value chain getting impacted with it. But coffee is quite close to heart because there is one number that I always begin with, and that is that 2.5 million cups of coffee is consumed every day in the world. While of course I'm assuming that number continues to change, but that is an average number really. What is more important is that we have seen the coffee prices continue to decline for a third straight month in the month of June. There has been an impact on the coffee growers, producers, processors as well. We understand from an USDA report that nearly 50 countries, whether they are producers or processors, have been impacted by the COVID-19, whether it has been about investment, processing, or sales for that matter as well. So while yes, there was an initial surge by almost 30% globally that we saw on people stocking up on coffee, but since then the demand has been slower and there is a bit of a price sensitivity to the people how much they buy. So that also seems to be impacting this market. We will, of course, have a detailed chat on coffee, the marketing, the investment, the whole value chain, and the government initiatives as well. But let me introduce my guest panelists to you first. I am joined by Mr. Deepak Kaul. He is Senior VP Coffee Business at Olam. Amit Pant is Senior VP Sales and Marketing at Tata Coffees. I also have Mr. DVR Rajiv Mohan. He is VP Value Added Agri Products at ITC. And Mr. Mukesh Kumar is Head Raw Material and Commodities Procurement, South Asia at Nestle. Gentlemen, thank you so much for making time out today for us. First of all, the format really is that we'll give you 10 to 15 minutes to make a presentation, do an opening comment. We will have a conversation then. And if there's a questions as well from the participants, we will take that too. So let me invite you, Mr. Mukesh Kumar, first of all, to present your views onto the sector.
What I would like to speak today basically from the consumer perspective. Like what as Nestle, we see this entire disruption, which is historic in the sense, and how we think that there are some issues, some way forward we see. So I'll be sharing few slides. I just thought of putting my views in few slides, and then we'll take it through. So, Rolly, is it visible? Um, is my screen visible?
Okay.
Not yet.
Yeah. Still not visible?
Not
No.
yet.
You have the presenter rights, Mr. Kumar. Maybe you can just, yes, it's coming now.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So, just broadly, if we see how this disruption happens and how it is affecting coffee as a global commodity. So, if you see the map, the globe is divided into the two segments of producers and consumer. So, it's a very clear-cut differentiation that the majority of producers in the southern part of the globe and the demand is majorly concentrated to the north part of the globe. And when we are facing a crisis like COVID, which historically and unprecedented in joint supply and demand disruption. Earlier we had crisis on supply front, sometimes we had slowdowns, but this is first of its kind when we are facing that both demand as well as supply are getting disrupted. And this disruption is not just a local disruption. This is a global disruption. You imagine a cafe in Italy who is dependent on the beans from Karnataka, what it would be facing in terms of such kinds of lockdowns, and what would be the possible scenario in terms of the scale of this lockdown. So this first slide, I just wanted to capture how the production and consumption is so distant, so that these kind of disruptions are going to impact this commodity on a global level. And the impact which we are witnessing right now, uh, you can see in the next slide. Just one second. I think there is some. Yes. So if you see, if you consider March as the COVID month, although I would refrain calling this pre-COVID, post-COVID, because we don't know that whether we are still in post-COVID or we are going through COVID. But if you see, just this is yesterday's chart of pricing of coffee, and the kind of volatility in prices, if you see from March till yesterday, it shows that how much uncertainty is there in the market, both in the supply side, both in the buyer's mind, both in the as well as seller's mind. The kind of fluctuation that you see market moving from 1350 to 1278, and in between the spikes and downside of the market. So this volatility is itself a replication of that. Yes, we had constraints. The moment we had unlock in the month of May, you see prices going up. And there is one more very noticeable part here. When we compare that, how it is behaving compared to all global commodities. So this is one commodity in the entire basket which has shown such volatility during this crisis. If you see major staple commodities, we haven't witnessed such severe volatilities on the pricing front. Basically, this kind of demand and supply disruptions, but somehow staples managed to avoid this volatility. So this is a very specific scenario for coffee, I would say. So now, in last 4 months, what we have seen as Nestle, what we are witnessing is, this is one of the uh, pointers which I got from my marketeer friends, that how our brands are behaving, how as a category coffee is behaving in the market. So if you see, it's a very centrally positioned somewhere between biscuits, in the center of the entire metrics, where there is a short-term impact ranging between 15 to 30% on the demand front, but long-term we are seeing a 5 to 10% kind of range. So very clearly in your opening address, as explained earlier, that yes, we did see a spike in the demand in the month of March, towards the end of the March, for stocking and pantry stocking purposes. But yes, the severe impact on the out of home consumption, which is dragging the category. So it is right now to the tune of 15 to 20% in a broader range for us. So giving a forecast that how it is going to pan out in next 6 months or 1 year down the line is very difficult right now. So we are taking month on month, but yes, we are hopeful that there are some green shoots coming, that people have converted these constraints into opportunities. So now your home is your new social space. So some of the trends, friends, I see that in-home consumption is on rise. Out-of-home consumption occasions have moved to home. Personally, we can say that most of us are baking cakes and making different drinks, dalgona coffee, posting on Instagram. So these things have certainly changed the pattern of coffee consumption in last few months. Obviously, pantry stocking has gone up, and there is another trend which I would like to mention here, that we see some kind of shift from RNG to instant coffee consumption. I would say it's a very premature right now, but yes, there are visible signs that some shift might take place uh, towards the instant coffee consumption. Now, this is the slide I would like to focus mostly on, because in past so many months we have seen several. So I'm not going to much more detailing on the demand and supply constraints. So I think other panelists who are experts on the commodities front will deep dive into those aspects. I would see that in Indian perspective, how we see this moving. And in last 3 months, if you see, government has taken, I would say, very bold steps in the area of agriculture reforms. Are these reforms are going to be the game changer for Indian agriculture and horticulture space? To some extent, we will see lot of action in agriculture. So as we are focusing on Atmanirbhar Bharat, so this is one crop which is mostly exported. 70 is to 30, 70 goes for export. So such kind of crops are going to focus of government from both from consumption perspective as well as from earning exports revenue perspective. So what I see that these constraints, these disruptions will give rise to certain kind of virtuous circle of three eyes, which I would mention as investment, infrastructure, and innovation. So investment, I would see that the laws around investment in agricultural commodities and other things have been getting removed. Contract farming is much more formal, and there will be a legal shape for that. So what it is going to take place, which I feel that it's going to give rise to much more of government investment, whether through coffee board or some other research organizations, and it's also going to increase through private players, basically on the research and development, varietal development front. Then infrastructure. When I compare with my Vietnamese counterpart in Nestle Vietnam, the kind of mechanization, the kind of field labs, the kind of practices they are adopting to is worth, I would say, worth adopting. So this is one space I would see that there is a lot of work which needs to be done, and the basis latest impetus, we will see that a lot of work happening around the infrastructure part, and not to forget the digital part of it. We will need the digital infrastructure for future, whether it's your crop mapping, whether your cup testing, whether your field labs. So how we are going to, whether your agronomy practices for the farmers, so digital ways of working, right from private players like us, like different trade houses, there will be certainly going to be investment in the infrastructure space from the digital perspective. Last but not the least, innovation. This innovation I'm not talking about, there is some different kinds of coffee, but this innovation will be triggered, and we have been witnessing getting triggered across the value chain, whether it's product, different kinds of coffees, different kinds of varieties, different locations, new geographies coming in, different kinds of innovation around pricing and trade. Because this particular incident has shown us that what a particular contract can get you into. If your consignments are stuck, if you don't know what to do, I don't know how many places we had force measures and other contract kind of getting discussions initiated. So certainly there is a scope on innovation around pricing, how to price your contracts better, how to mitigate the risks around your contracts. So innovation trade as well as pricing is going to be the new innovation. And another important part, diversification. Because if you see the pricing, we are towards as a global commodity, although Indian differentials are way high. But if you see a global level, we were 2 months back, we are around 10 years lows. So how diversification is going to help the farmers in terms of whether diversification around different spices which are compatible to coffee growing like pepper, cardamom, so mitigate both the product risk as well as price risk. So this is the virtuous circle which I was thinking is getting triggered in the ecosystem, and it's not going to be done by one single player. If as Nestle today, I want to change the entire system, it's not going to happen. So what is needed is a shared action plan through pre-competitive organizations where different stakeholders coming on a such kind of platform to with these enablers in the system, which will certainly going to influence, certainly going to protect the growers, to protect the trade, and protect everyone, and simultaneously growing the overall trade. Now, one opportunity I would like to briefly mention, which I see personally that India is lagging right now, and there is a lot of scope around this, which is sustainability. So, if you see globally, uh, mm, the percentage of conventional coffee versus different kind of sustainable coffee grown is almost 50-50. At a global level, 50% coffee consumed is getting consumed as a certified coffee of different kinds of certification. But if you see in India, still we are lagging from the globe perspective. I do understand there are a lot of dynamics around consumer demands and what is the premium, but this is the next level which we see that we need to emphasize as a coffee stakeholder uh, in India, where we can catch up with the global peers, whether it's competing for Europe from exporters' perspective. That I don't know how long this 500 plus differentials for India is. Different European countries are going to pay. Uganda is catching up, and other different origins are catching up. So we need to up the game towards the sustainability, and there is a lot of scope where we can improve. So these are some of the points which I thought that we should initiate discussion around with different coffee stakeholders. And sustainability, why? If you see, our consumption globally is inching closer to output. So few, if different kinds of risks around, if Brazil would have not been a better position, then this year only we would have been a much stress from the production and consumption balance perspective. So sustainability is just not a certification. Here we need to look it as a, if we need to grow coffee for our future generations, that coffee will remain as a drink and it's growing in consumption. So how to match that demand? So that is one part that sustainability will let it happen the way it should be. So these are the points from my side. Let us discuss further with other panelists. So some of the product ideas, this is just as a differentiator. If we see that what we can consider, because there is still very less differentiation when it comes to coffee within Indian space, or whether it's organic coffee or high grown coffees, or we have different imports grades exported out of India, but even the awareness level of Indian consumer is still lacking. So we see that from the consumers branded players perspective, there is a scope that we need to diversify, and with the specialty coffees, both from the risking perspective as well as growing the consumer base perspective. So these are some of the ideas we'll be looking forward for. Thank you. Over to you, Manisha.
Thank you, Mr. Kumar. I absolutely get your point. You know, there are coffee lovers and there are instant coffee drinkers then, and I think the instant coffee drinkers are by far the highest numbers there. But I also get your point on digitization and sustainability and the fact that the price volatility has been much higher. And when you look at the crop production is way high, and we perhaps are going to end with a 6-year highs global carry forward stock is what we are working with right now. But thank you so much for that. We will take that conversation forward. But in the meanwhile, Mr. Deepak Kaul, you're next, and we would want to hear your initial comments as well.
Thank you, Manisha. First of all, I would like to thank the CII team for hosting this event and giving me the opportunity to interact and put forward probably some views and points that I have and that we have as an organization. Could I share my screen, please?
Yes, and Mr. Kaul, perhaps your video is also shut off, so we can't see you.
Oh, sorry, I'm sorry.
Right.
Yeah, is it okay now?
Yes, yes, sir.
You would need to give me the presenter.
Yes, I've already shared the drive, so you can share your screen now.
Are you able to see my screen? Or is it still in the...
Still the same issue. We're able to see the notes
Okay, I will see.
And also the box that was there earlier.
Is it okay now? Is this okay now?
Yes, yes. Yeah.
Okay. So like I was saying, thanks to the CII team and Manisha for hosting the session. Mm, Who would have imagined 6 months back that we would be sitting here in our respective homes and living rooms discussing resilient supply chains and the coffee world while having been stuck at home for more than 4 months. So unprecedented times call for unprecedented agility. And I think what probably we could take away from this discussion is that the world has really shown unprecedented agility and adaptability in order to deal with some of the issues that we have been forced to fix. Uh, I would probably I had wanted to share a presentation and discuss some of the issues, but I think my co-panelist and previous presenter actually stole my thunder and has essentially covered a lot of what I had to say. But what I will try and do is provide a bit of a green coffee outside in perspective for India, and therefore hopefully most of it would not be a repetition of what we've already seen. So I would just take you through some trends, key trends and drivers for coffee, challenges that we need to overcome, opportunities for India, and probably share with you some final thoughts. So just a brief introduction to Olam. So we are a global coffee company integrated across the value chain. We are sourcing from almost all possible producing countries in the Americas, in Africa, and in Asia. And we have marketing centers across the globe selling coffee to our customers in the consuming countries. So as you can see, there is a clear split between producing countries and consuming countries. And therefore, you would sort of come back to the point that my previous panelist was making about the physical distance between producers and consumers, which has really been highlighted by the current situation of the COVID pandemic. Just quickly glancing through the trends in the coffee market, I think starting always with the good news first. I think what we can definitely say is that longer-term consumption trends are fairly healthy and secular. We have a blip in 2020 in terms of consumption, but we still believe that consumption will catch up, and longer-term the demand is healthy. However, what that really means is that we need to produce an additional 40 million bags of coffee over the next 10 years to satisfy or satiate the demand of coffee lovers across the world. And that would mean a significant ramp up in terms of production capacity across the world. And with the way production is sort of concentrated in the current context, we really don't see too much of a scope other than the two large producing countries, Brazil and Vietnam, in order to sort of fill this gap. What this would also mean is that prices have to stay at a reasonable level for the markets to incentivize increase in production and production of coffee. So according to our estimate, prices between the 140 to 150 cents per pound mark on New York is probably the sweet spot where there is enough incentive for producers to produce coffee. We are currently trading way below this band, and if you would see that over the course of the last 12 odd years, we have traded below this threshold for significantly longer periods of time, and that really has been the period where we have seen oversupplies, and at the same time we have seen impacts on smallholder farmers and impacts in terms of reduction in crops of certain countries where the cost of production are high. We have also seen an unprecedented sort of divergence between critical drivers of market prices. So while we are seeing from a historical perspective low stock to consumption ratios, we are also seeing at the same time historically low market levels. If you sort of flatten the pricing out for time uh, and 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 take out the outlying events. There are multiple reasons for this, and I probably would spend a minute trying to sort of dissect why we are where we are today. I think the biggest reason has been the polarization of production between two very large countries, Brazil and Vietnam. And these countries, whatever happens in these countries in terms of their macroeconomic situation, really has a large impact on coffee prices. Over the last 1 year, the Brazilian currency, Brazilian real, has been continuously depreciating. And while the coffee market has been at has touched all-time low, I mean historical lows, Brazilian farmer has been getting a record high price in terms of local currency for its produce. So therefore, there has been enough and more incentive for the Brazilian farmer to keep on producing and investing in coffee, while the rest of the world has been really struggling to play catch up because most other countries are struggling to survive because the market prices are below their cost of production. So what are the challenges that we see in the coffee supply chain? I think a chain is as strong as its weakest link, and unfortunately for us, the weakest link or the most vulnerable link in our coffee supply chains is the smallholder producer. And there are essentially, if you look at challenges in the supply chain, we essentially are looking at two things. One is near-term challenges that have been brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic, and which have been sort of exacerbated by the fragmented nature of our supply chains, which makes it extremely difficult to coordinate responses to some of these crises that we are faced with. So essentially, we are talking of health and safety of our farming community, the bottlenecks in logistics, closing of borders, what the previous panelists mentioned, the drop in demand for higher quality and specialty coffee, because most of those coffees are consumed out of home, and of course, freezing and suspension of a lot of farm development projects and aid funding which used to go towards farmer development. So how have we as Olam responded to some of these? So earlier this year in the month of May, we gave out a call for action to the industry to come and support countries that were getting into their harvest seasons for the Southern Hemisphere. And we were really glad that we received a lot of support from the industry in terms of immediate supply and donations for providing safety and PPE equipment to many farming communities. So two cases in point I have put over here. One is in Papua New Guinea, where we engaged with the pastors, because churches are very strong there, with the pastors, and spreading communication on personal hygiene and how to protect from infection, and also distribution of PPEs. Similarly, in India, which is closer to home, we coordinated with the local health authorities and set up swab testing kiosks in the coffee growing areas. And similarly, in many other countries which were in harvest season, we spent a lot of time, effort, and used support from many of our customers and partners to bring in much needed supplies in the near term. Now we are at the cusp of the next season, which is the Northern Hemisphere harvest season, which will probably start towards September. And we are also looking forward to customers and partners supporting us for providing equipment and material for the countries that will start producing or start harvesting in that season, India included. And in the long term, if I were to see challenges in the long term, I think the biggest challenge, like I mentioned earlier, the most vulnerable link in our supply chain is the smallholder farmer. And if we were to really look at resilient supply chains going forward, I think this is the area where we have to work the most. And therefore, how do we work on farmer income? How do we work on improving their quality and consistency and productivity? Some as the key element of the long-term challenges that the industry faces. The other challenge is around the consolidation of the industry. We have seen that large roasters have increasingly amounted to a large share of the market, and therefore there is lack of diversity of choices. And since most of these producers, most of these large industry participants are focused on the more mainstream varieties of the coffee. And of course, the last one is the logistics inefficiencies that still mire a lot of the small big producer countries, where it is still a struggle to get coffee out of the bush and into a boat destined to be consumed now. So how do we sort of address these challenges? I think my co-panelist in Nestle really sort of hit the nail on the head. So the only way to address some of these challenges, at least in the way we look at it, is revolves around the two pillars of technology, innovation, and sustainable growth. So low farmer income, consolidation of the industry, and logistics and efficiencies. I think there are solutions for each of these issues in these two pillars, which probably I will elaborate slightly going forward. So what are the opportunities for India? I think that's probably topical for this conversation. India is a producer of differentiated coffees, the third largest producer, the fifth largest exporter in the world, the third largest producer in Asia, and therefore India's share of differentiated coffees has been growing over the years. So now, like my previous, so I sort of loosely define differentiated coffees as coffees with some kind of a unique selling story, and therefore we are looking at now almost 12% of Indian coffees being sold and shipped as differentiated coffees, and of course a large part of that is unique coffees like monsoon coffees, the Wasp Robusta coffees, the Cafe Royale, and some of the other higher end coffees that are going mostly into the specialty markets. But we cannot be complacent. If you see the chart on the left, it is essentially India's export across various destinations, and you can see that there is a very high concentration in a couple of markets, and very large concentration. Almost a third of the Indian exports go to Italy. And as we have seen over the last few months, the Italian market being heavily dependent on out-of-home consumption, we are seeing the precipitous drop in consumption in Italy, and therefore that is impacting the Indian coffee exports as well. Similarly, on the right-hand side, you see a chart of Indian coffee differentials versus the base of Robusta differentials, which is Vietnam, and the London market. And you can see that the Indian coffee prices have been at a significant premium to its largest competing origin, which therefore brings into play a perceived price to value imbalance. Means if you want to really expand your market base or diversify out of certain markets, you need to be closer to your largest competitor, which is not the case today. So therefore, the opportunities of India are really to diversify actively into other markets and build on the years of coffee research that exists in India to improve farmer productivity. I would probably like to come back to the 2 points that I talked about earlier: technology and sustainability and sustainable growth. So these are the pillars, I believe, on which we would have to build in order to get from where we are to where we really want to be. And this really revolves around 2 aspects on the technology side. One is the disruption, which is essentially connecting the farmers to the consumers and using digital technologies to enhance or break that compromise that exists today. And the second part is about transformation. So transformation of our supply chains, transformation of our farming systems, transformation of our manufacturing systems, using the various technologies that are available and that can be made available, and that will be available in the future to basically bring about a sea change in terms of the way our supply chains are managed. And at Olam, we have been working on trying to bridge this technology gap. So in 2019, we launched a farmer services platform in India, and India was the first country where we launched it. It's called AgriCentral, and it's an app-based platform which brings farmers the ability to get information. To get information and connect them to various participants in the agri ecosystem, and also provide them information about weather, about prices, about news from the community at their fingertip on a mobile based application. And on the other side, in order to bridge the gap between the producer and the consumer, we are trying to build applications and use technology for farmers to be able to access various markets and sell directly to Olam and get connected to customers. And through that platform, we provide agronomy advice, tutorials, and advice on good agricultural practices, and also bringing participants to provide cheaper financing and things like agri inputs which the farmers need. So just to sort of close the loop on this discussion and put in some final thoughts for resilience in our supply chains. Like I was mentioning, the weakest or the most vulnerable link in our supply chain is the farmer. And if you were to take anything away from this presentation, it is the last point, which is, as industry participants and as participants in this sector, we need to rally behind our farmers. And I believe once the farmers are financially viable and are sustainable economically and environmentally, we would cover most of the other issues that our supply chain faces. And with that, I would thank you again for this opportunity. And back to you, Manisha.
Mr. Kaul, thank you so much. I get your point. I mean, there are three buzzwords that you and Mr. Kumar have actually repeated quite a lot of times. I should have counted that. But yes, technology, innovation, sustainability. I get these 3 points is what my panelists really are looking to make. Yes, the long-term demand seems healthy, as Mr. Paul said, but there are challenges, whether it comes from farm or income or logistics. And that is something that the markets perhaps will really have to look at. But with that, let's move on to our next panelist. And for his initial comments, Mr. Amit Pant, we invite you for the same.
Hi, thank you very much, Manisha. Thank you, CII, for giving me this opportunity. May I request Roli to put I'm taking this presentation on a handheld device, so if I could be assisted with the presentation being played out there. Thank you. So just to set the context, I think both Mukesh and Deepak spoke quite, I would say, evocatively about the upstream part of this business. The upstream part of this business has been very clearly impacted over the last 3 months of pandemic now, just over 3 months of pandemic, more so in India. I thought that I will, when I looked at the word resilience, I thought I'd look at something which is more downstream in nature, and which has perhaps, to me, shown the maximum resilience. If you look at the various categories of coffee which have, which have reacted to the pandemic globally, and it was only pertinent to sort of speak about instant coffee. And I know Mukesh did mention instant coffee's the impact of instant coffee in Nestle's scheme of things, or the potential impact of instant coffee in Nestle's scheme of things. But I thought, from a more Indian B2B and export history point of view, more so at this stage, it's very relevant to have a look at instant coffee. I mean, this is a category which has shown over the last 10 years remarkable resilience. It has shown remarkable relevance. It has been written off again and again, and every time instant coffee as a category or as a portfolio been written off, it has come back strongly than before. So, it's a very short presentation, about 7-8 slides, and I would like to draw your attention towards largely how we've seen instant coffee play out historically, and over the last few months, the real sort of worth it has been able to convey to the world of coffee, and how it will remain very relevant to India how it was relevant in the last 10 years, and how we believe that it will continue to stay extremely relevant to India in the next 10 years. May I request you to go to the next slide, please? Yeah, so you essentially are seeing the whole spectrum. I wouldn't spend much time onto it. This is really the bean to cup story as we know it pictorially. You see the coffee fruit on the left hand side, extreme left corner, and the moment it moves, the lower row is the consumer facing version of coffee. You have roast and ground coffee on the left, and the 3 variants of instant coffee on the right, bottom right. Just to show you that instant coffee has 3 specific parts. It started out with spray dried coffee years ago, and then a couple of decades ago it sort of metamorphosized into agglomerated coffee. And the latest version of instant coffee is freeze dried coffee, which has been in vogue for the past 20 years. It's been more popular in the past 20 years. But really, these are the 3 main variants of instant coffee that you see across the world. And on the left, you see the usual filter coffee as it's known in India. Yeah, move on, please. Yes, the next slide. So this is really the evolution curve, if you will, for a coffee drinker. So and this is not to be not to be dismissive about coffee drinkers, or this is just an experience curve. Typically, what we've seen is across geographies, when consumers migrate from tea to coffee, the first sort of rung of the ladder is coffee mixes that you see on the bottom left. And then there is a gradual progression. You saw spray and agglomerated in the last graphic on the last page, which is the first sort of rung on the instant coffee ladder. And then you move on to freeze dried, and then you move on to the fresh coffee, the roast and ground coffee, and some of the more novel variants of roast and ground coffee. And on the top, you see stuff which has been popular in the past 5 years, like specialty cold brew and so on and so forth. So this is really the taste curve more than anything else of a particular of a drinker. Instant coffee in particular is towards the bottom, and bottom middle. Next slide, please. So the world of coffee, I think Deepak also mentioned, is about 170 million bags of coffee. Largely, coffee as it's known across the world is fresh, roast and ground, or filter coffee as it's more popularly called in India. It's about 80% of the volume of coffee at farm gate, so to say. So 8 out of 10 bags of coffee harvested are used for fresh coffee production. But 20% of the world's coffee today is used for instant coffee. And in that 20%, it's a very, I would say it's a very unique marketplace where almost 2/3 of that 20%, almost 2/3 of the world of instant coffee is dominated by a few large brands across the world who are also producers, manufacturers themselves. And there is also lies the opportunity. I mean, almost 1/3 of world's coffee is people who own brands, but they don't have the investments or they can't afford the investments in assets, or they don't feel it's relevant to invest in an asset. Their strength is their front end domain. They are either brand owners or they are private labelers, but they basically own the consumer, and they expect their supply chain work to be done by people who are expert in that field. So clearly, I think the world is split between large manufacturers and brand owners on the majority, but there is a very sizable minority, an effective minority of B2B manufacturers. Next slide, please. So why instant coffee? And one of the reasons why, as I mentioned, instant coffee has really sort of had a revival of sorts in the past 3-4 months is exactly the reasons why it became popular during the First World War. There are lots of stories around that, and there's no time for me to get into those stories, historical stories of instant coffee. But really, it became popular with the American soldiers in the First War, which is close to 100 years, over 100 years from today. And the factors which sort of swung the deal in the favor of instant coffee then are not very different from what really mattered to instant coffee in the last 3 months. Convenience, number one. Great economics, very long shelf life, and ease of shipping, storage, shelf space. Everything actually resonates value, and that's really has been the the standout feature of instant coffee. Even in this pandemic, whenever you need value to be delivered quickly, whenever you needed value to be delivered in an economic manner, and whenever you needed value to be delivered where you were not compromising a great deal of coffee taste, you had no further to look. So instant coffee was your answer 100 years ago, and instant coffee actually came to the party even in this pandemic. Next slide, please. So I've just sort of rambled around in this slide about the instant coffee markets across the world. What you clearly see is that the global consumption of instant coffee today is really the tea drinking world. If you see the potential of consumption, or you see the momentum in the next 5 to 10 years, it is largely the conversion which we expect will happen from the tea drinking world. Countries like China, large parts of Middle East, parts of Africa are going to be leading the pack, although on a small base. We would believe that in the OECD countries, the consumption is on the defensive. In fact, it will marginally decline. But once again, the large demographies, whether it's Southeast Asia or parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, even, and I'll come to that in a bit, China and India, are going to be the real drivers of instant coffee as we move forward and as we look at the next 10 years from now of growth of instant coffee. Clearly, I think demographics play a very, very vital role in terms of driving the agenda for instant coffee, and it's growing at a healthy clip of about 3% per annum. And I'm sure even when the pandemic plays out, unfortunately, large part of the impact will be borne by on-premise out-of-home consumption. But we do believe that instant coffee will hold its ground firmly in the next in the next 6 months of this year, and perhaps going forward in the next 1 or 2 quarters next year as well. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I think if you look at instant coffee, had unlike the slide which Deepak showed earlier, there are historical reasons on the origins of instant coffee. Unlike agriculture, which has largely determined the output of bean coffee or the output of crops across the world, instant coffee has had many historical reasons why it was produced in a certain cluster of geographies and why it was not produced elsewhere. So if you look at the graphic there, I think large parts of instant coffee comes from the European Union, it comes from ASEAN, Brazil, and India. India has been a very, very, I wouldn't say dominant, but it's been a very effective player in the world of instant coffee from the time it started, at least on the international trade front. And the reasons why it was, it's always been a key player in the international front, I would come to in future slides. If you can move on to the next slides, please. The next slide, please. Yeah. So here's a graphic which is quite heartwarming. If you look at the last 10 years of instant coffee only, the volumes have actually grown. If you see 2009-10, the volumes were at about, this is green bean equivalent, which is how the Coffee Board expresses it, about 65,000 tons of green bean. In 10 years, it has gone to 112,000 tons of green bean equivalent. But I think the more important thing is the revenues have actually almost grown 3 times. If you look at where we were in 2009-10, it's just under 600 crores. It is close to 2,000 crores now. So this is my mistake. I think in 2009-10 it was 750 crores, and it has now gone to close to 2,000 crores. So what it really does is, if you look at the CAGR of volumes, it has grown by 6%, which is almost perhaps 2.5 times the global growth rate. The more interesting thing is it has grown by 10% over the last 10 years compounded annually. Now, I'm not aware of many things in this fiercely competitive country which have grown by this yardstick. So it's really a whopper of growth. And even if there is a bit of a blip, and I think Deepak made this point very, very pertinently earlier, that it's not only bean coffee where Brazil is dominating, even coffee today, a large part of India's share is perhaps being nibbled away by competition. But still, I think if you take a longer time frame, perhaps over the next 2-3 years, I think the picture will emerge intact, because there is fundamental competitiveness which India brings to the table. And if I have to look at the 2 or 3 success factors of India in this very resilient category, I think the first is the trade ties with Russia, which is how it started off perhaps 20 years ago or 25 years ago when Tata started their soluble coffee operations. It was largely a Russia play, which also rode piggyback on the tea trade at that time. And it really gave India a head start because, Russia till this date, after all it's gone through in the last perhaps 20 years, remains the single largest country of consumption of instant coffee. I think what also really sort of the two other factors, in my opinion, which really blessed Indian coffee, Indian instant coffee, were one is the coffee origin. The whole piece about India being, and Deepak mentioned this earlier, about the 5th largest exporter of coffee, an ingrained coffee culture in this country, solid instant coffee being very, very popular in certain parts of India. So something very familiar and very the touch and feel being always there about instant coffee, even domestically, and a large talent pool which is available. Now, bear in mind, it's typically a category which requires a lot of investment going to the ground, and you need specialized talent to run these factories. And India has always had that talent, not only within India, but also India has been actually a source of this talent to overseas soluble plants as well. And I think international competitiveness, India was always competitive when it started about 10 years ago. It remains less competitive now due to various reasons, but I think there was significant international competitiveness that we had due to certain trade flows, due to currencies being very favorable at the time when we started getting into this. So there were these three factors which really sort of brought this effectiveness to Indian exports, which resulted in this scorching growth of 10% CAGR that you see over the last 10 years in rupee terms. Next slide, please. So today the picture is, I would not say fundamentally changed, but there are challenges on the horizon which I see, and I thought I'd sort of list out those challenges when we look at instant coffee. Clearly, I think there is a significant, what was earlier, as I mentioned in the last slide, a competitive advantage to us in terms of cost and so many other things, is no longer an advantage. Brazil with Robusta crop doubling over the past 5-6 years, its currency, which has been continuously on the defensive, again for the past 2 to 3 years, more particularly in the last 1 year, has really been dominant in this world of coffee. But these are cyclical issues. It's important that we take cognizance of this today. It could be it's Brazil today, it could be some other country tomorrow, but these pressures are going to remain for us, and we really have to find the niche to be cost competitive, because that's really the forte of this country. I mentioned running cost earlier. There are countries today where the running costs are much cheaper. It wasn't the case perhaps 10 years ago, but today there are several countries which have stolen a march on India in terms of cost of running an instant coffee factory. So I think those are critical things that we need to bear in mind. And if we need to grow at this clip for the next 10 years, to me, I think cost competitiveness is the cornerstone of any success story, and it has to be the case in India as well. Secondly, the producer tag has become very popular across the world on instant coffee. When people look at Brazil, Vietnam, it's not only fresh coffee or coffee crop per se, but also for instant coffee, produced in Vietnam, produced in Brazil today is much more recognizable than produced in India because of their sheer scale. India was largely a Russia play, and as Russia moves towards other types of coffees, notably towards fresh coffees and more roast and ground, high quality coffees, the advantage which India enjoyed as an origin or a producer tag is missing now, or is slowly disappearing, and I think we need to work on that. Similarly, some of the countries which don't grow coffee but are extremely popular in terms of producer tags, and two countries which come to my mind are Italy and Germany. They produce a lot of coffee which they don't consume. Germany in particular produces a lot of instant coffee which is not nowhere consumed in Germany, but it's universally liked across the world because it brings a certain assurance, it brings a certain class and reliability to either the private labeler or even to the consumer of coffee. And I think India needs to work on that if we need to sustain our competitive advantage. Thirdly, I think another thing which would be a significant challenge, particularly the sort of world that we are now witnessing, and I think we've got used to since Brexit happened in 2016, is the world is increasingly dominated by trades and tariffs. And I think we just cannot be sitting at sidelines and allow other countries to dominate this space earlier than we do. I mean, I know for sure that the Brazilians are very active, the Vietnamese are very active on this. I think it's time India gets active. We need to strike these partnerships to help the coffee industry in India. Uh, whether it's the European Union or the United States or the ASEAN countries, we have to put money where the mouth is. And clearly, I think this is a core challenge. The world is not going to get any less fragmented as we move on. And these are the, these are some of these things which whatever you do, at the last mile will make you either very competitive or not competitive at all. Next slide, please. So I think as we move ahead, perhaps my last slide about opportunities in India, I think we continue to be the biggest advantage that we have is that we are favorably located in the global instant coffee landscape of things. We have on both sides, we either from a supply side or from a market side, we have bounties. We have the large demographics of Southeast Asia on one side. We have large and emerging consumption geographies of Middle East and Africa on the other side. So on both sides of the Indian Ocean rim, there are significant opportunities that I see, and we are very firmly placed logistically to capitalize on them in the next 5 to 10 years. I also believe, and if I have to go by a recent report by Euromonitor, which was published earlier this year, that the largest delta in the next 5 years in terms of instant coffee consumption would be nowhere else but India. So I think India as a country holds supreme promise in terms of consumption of instant coffee. And there is no reason why it cannot replicate what Brazil has done in terms of fresh coffee over the past 20 years in the next 10 years. I think there is a lot of energy and entrepreneurship which I see in India today. There are, if you go to any supermarkets across the large cities, you see a plethora of brands which were not there perhaps even 2 years ago or 3 years ago. So there are a lot of these options. The consumer is really spoiled, even in instant coffee, to say nothing about fresh coffee or sensorial coffee for that matter. Even on instant coffee, there is, so you can see the energy and momentum that India is bringing to the table. I think that perhaps is a large advantage that we carry. And I think what we need to work upon is the proactive approach, as I said, on trades and tariffs. So, really, I think we should look at this pandemic as an opportunity to see things which have really stood the test of this human crisis, health crisis over the last 3-4 months. And when I look at coffee, and I represent a company which has significant land assets under plantation. So we also, there is an upstream part of business which has been which has been put to test. There is a midstream part of the business that we have in India which has been put to test. But I think perhaps if you look at the one part of the business globally which has emerged with a lot of credit, and it's instant coffee. So I think being in India, we should not allow this opportunity to fritter away. As I mentioned, we've had 10 very good years, and for another 10 good years, we need to do the right things. And if we are able to sort of press those right levers, I'm sure those 10 years of growth will not be only 10 years, but future 10 years as well. Thanks. That's all from my side. I'm open for any questions.
All right, Mr. Pant, instant coffee, it is. India is a major player. And I do get your point about the convenience. It's economical, the storage, the shipment. Yes, you actually do tick a lot of boxes right there. But we also have one more panelist now remaining. And Mr. Rajiv Mohan, do take it away.
Manisha mentioned about the 2.5 billion cups of coffee. But I think she little realized that the people behind the coffee, their views would be so convergent that and their slides perhaps would be even more convergent. So you'll have to bear with me as the last speaker if I kind of repeat most of the things which have been said this evening. But I'd rather take this as more of a recap session and go ahead with what I have to say. Just to give you a quick perspective about Indian coffee, India produces about 3.2 lakh metric tons, largely in small holdings, has a combination of both Arabica and Robusta. Domestic consumption is pretty small, about 0.7 lakh metric tons, and the exports is 3.4 lakhs. That's because apart from green coffee, there's instant coffee, of which a good portion of it is actually imported coffee, which gets value added and re-exported. But if you really look at the kind of USP of Indian coffee, it's largely shade grown, marketability of both washed and unwashed coffees. When you have a unique offering in the Indian monsoon Malabar coffee, and the market is also characterized by the availability of both Arabica and Robusta coffees. I'd rather stick to the green coffee supply chain, and if you really look at the cost build-up, nearly 90% of it is in the production at the farm end of it. The input supplies are 32%, and this is largely characterized by low mechanization, poor irrigation, because the cost of irrigating is very, very high, and the high input and material costs. If you look at the farming and the production, again, there's low productivity of most of our plantations compared to what you see in competing origins. There's a very high risk of pests and diseases, and this actually is a perennial problem which affects the growers. And then you have very poor package of practices, and this actually impacts the quality of what gets produced. When you look at the processing, most of the milling technology is pretty outdated. They are lower capacities, a lot of fragmented and large number of factories, but with small capacities, which actually makes economies of scale very difficult to achieve. And because of the archaic storage practices, there's a lot of loss because of the moisture loss which happens. Logistics, I need to say more. I mean, there are issues in terms of road transportation, which leads to increased freight cost, and the port infrastructure, which is not really up to the mark. And then, as the earlier panelists have spoken, there's a higher dependence on a few markets, destination markets, and very suboptimal value capture in terms of what we do in exports. So if we look at a quick competitive benchmarking with what we see across, especially with the nearest competitor like Vietnam, I won't really bother you with most of the details, but just look at the production. But we do about 3.2 lakh metric tons, and their production is 18 lakh metric tons. For us, Arabica accounts for 50% of the area, but only 25% of the production. And for them, Arabica accounts only for 6% of the area and 4 to 5% of the production. And the real point to be noted here is a 100-fold increase in production in the last 20 years. I mean, if you look at 1986 through 2016 and still counting. So what really is the thing, I mean, the factors which we need to take away from here? It's that, what they have been doing at the back end in terms of the farming techniques, how they are being able to coordinate and market their coffee better in terms of the exports. Very quickly covering what has happened to India and the learnings from COVID. I think we need to strengthen the premiumness of Indian coffee. It's been already commented that we've been losing share to other origins like Uganda and Vietnam. There needs to be an aggressive thrust towards our marketing towards more of branded players and supermarket roasters, shifting away from the traditional marketing focus, which is largely Horeca and gourmet roasters in Europe. We need to ramp up our efforts to boost the domestic consumption, and this is again being highlighted. And there needs to be a very good balance between what we do in exports and in the domestic market. And a lot of focus on technology, automation, and bringing about efficiencies, because we're seeing that as we go along, labor is going to be an issue. So how do we look at increased investment in automation and mechanization so that we bring in an element of efficiency and competency in the Indian coffee? So what I have is the 3 R's, the interventions to build the resilient supply chain. The first thing is revitalizing the production. And here, I think we need to look at R&D efforts to especially eliminate the stem borer and improve the productivity. I think the focus also needs to be on produce the buy, rather than trying to market whatever is produced. I think operators need to look at backward integration, look at putting in farming and harvesting techniques in place, which would actually help the planters produce coffee which is more marketable. We also need to kind of reinvigorate the supply chain, for which there needs to be extension services, especially focusing on the post-harvest techniques, so that we are able to again get the buy which we would like to market. The Coffee Board has already done a brilliant job with the introduction of blockchain. I think we need to leverage that to improve transparency and traceability. Also to be able to understand where there are those specific pools of coffee which people would want to access and market. And of course, like I mentioned earlier, in the supply chain, not just at the farm level, but across, I think there's a need for improved automation and mechanization of operations. The last part of the chain, I think we need to recalibrate our marketing efforts. We need to promote more of uniqueness. So look at how we can GI tag specific regions, like for example, Araku coffee, work on the back end and improve the quality of Araku coffee, but can I GI tag that specific region and then market it as a unique offering to the customers? I mean, that's just an example, but we could look at multiple other regions doing that. Map of the premium estates so that we can harness the potential of specialty coffees, and also look at sustainable offerings in terms of either organic or the certified coffees, and broad base our marketing into newer markets in terms of more of geographies where the coffee consumption is increasing, and also work on boosting the domestic consumption, because the general this thing is chai ho jai, but nobody says coffee ho jai. So how do we kind of build on and further give a boost to the coffee culture, the consumption of coffee as we go along in the domestic market? So I would just say that the way forward would be that we need to focus on the 3 R's of revitalizing production, reinvigorating the supply chain, and recalibrating the marketing efforts. So this is largely what I have to say from a green coffee perspective. Thank you very much to everybody. Thank you very much, CII. And all of you, wherever you are, stay well and safe. Thank you very much.
Mr. Mohan, thank you. And while all of you clearly have listed out a lot of data, insights, problems, and the solutions as well, Mr. Rajiv Mohan, since you were my last speaker, the first question is to you as well. You did mention about the per capita consumption in India, which is actually quite on the lower side. The production numbers, of course, are we can still talk about in sense of competition, but consumption, and you did say that it's more about tea rather than coffee. Maybe southern states, yes, the numbers are high. But when you look at Western India, Northern India, is it more about out-of-home consumption that we see in sense of coffee?
Basically, if you look at the market today, yes, it's largely overall. If you see South India, yes, is more of perhaps within the home, but the rest of India is largely out of home. But I think as we go along, people, as they understand coffee consumption, as they, kind of coffee as a product gets demystified, I think slowly the home consumption is increasing. And in a scenario like COVID, where out of home, per se is not possible, I think the industry needs to work on more options of within the home consumption. So as we go along, I see that that market definitely has an opportunity to grow in India.
Mr. Kaul, this one is to you. While, of course, we are looking at the production increase, the cost of production increase as well. But when you look at the coffee prices itself, that hasn't really kept up with that pace. What is the kind of outlook that you have right now? I'm assuming all of you have worked with a lot of forecasts and calculations, but with the way we are in this situation with COVID-19, and we don't know when the peak is going to come into India, what is the next 3 or 6 months looking like? How much have you changed in sense of these numbers, forecasts, etc.?
You're asking me to do a little bit of crystal ball gazing, but from a purely from a view perspective, our own internal in-house view is that where we are today in terms of coffee prices, coffee is undervalued as a commodity. Because if you see, excepting Brazil being a notable exception, coffee prices today are either at or below cost of production for most producing countries. So therefore, the function of the market, if you will, is to incentivize production and bring supply and demand to an equilibrium, and also ensure the longer term sustainability of production. Therefore, purely from a valuation perspective, we believe that coffee is undervalued, and therefore we would hope that prices do improve over the course of the next few months. However, like I said, there are other factors at play which are keeping the lid on coffee prices, and the biggest one out of them is the depreciation of currencies in certain producing countries, notably Brazil and Colombia. And therefore, it's really a play between how much the currencies depreciate versus how much the markets rally to sort of account for that. So at this point of time, really, we do believe that coffee is undervalued and therefore should be at a higher level than where we are today. But there are a lot of other factors at play which are keeping the prices where they are.
But are you willing to stick your neck out and say on what we are looking at in sense of percentage gains? Because this year has been a decline. I think, please correct me if I have the numbers wrong, but 7.5% of decline in coffee prices in this year, and this perhaps is a fourth or a fifth year that we have seen decline in prices. So how do we see this year closing? What are the calculations that you have for the next financial year now?
I mean, if you look at where we closed the last year versus where we are today, you're right, we are at a 7% decline, but we had a sharp rally in prices towards the end of last year. So if you were to really take average prices for the last year, we are more or less at similar prices. The decline is not much. And really, if I don't have that chart in front of me, but if you were to really plot the coffee price versus the Brazilian real, you would see a very, very high correlation in terms of the way coffee prices have moved with the Brazilian real, and therefore Brazilian real going from 455 and then 5 to 550 has really impacted coffee prices also. So therefore, coffee prices today are where they have to be in terms of managing the Brazilian producer. So the Brazilian producer still is able to get a very good price for his coffee, and we are at the peak of the harvesting season for Brazil. So there is a lot of selling pressure at the moment from Brazil, and therefore the Brazilian producer actually determines what the price of the market should be at this point of time. We believe that once the pressure from the Brazilian producer recedes, we could see a rally in the market, a small rally in the market.
Mr. Kumar, this one is to you, and it's a well said line that we do understand, we do learn, or we make the toughest choices or take chances when we are stuck in difficult times. And this is a global pandemic that we're dealing with right now. How do you look at changes coming in? You did speak about sustainability, technology, e-commerce perhaps is another way. Are you changing business? Is this scenario a game changer?
Yeah, thanks, Manisha. So I would take this question from two perspectives, one from the brand perspective and another from the supply chain perspective. Just I missed because supply chain was, I don't think in my last 15 years of career, I have seen supply chain in so much of focus that right from Prime Minister till our CEOs, every discussion supply chain. So this we are approaching as a company that how to make our supply chain more resilient, whether in terms of production, whether in terms of distribution, whether in terms of availability at marketplace. So that we are changing because this is the time where your brand is a secondary thing. Availability is the primary thing. Last 2-3 months, we have seen a lot of changes around that. People going for to buy different brands, they're picking up whatever is available. So one, from the availability perspective, we are addressing it. Then certainly we are looking at how to mitigate the out of home consumption loss which we have suffered. So broadly, it contributes close to 15 to 20% range for RKT. So we are seeing green shoots for the month of May and June. And we will be certainly focusing on some new segments, some new ways of marketing through digital, some new things like you have seen Nescafe E, the coffee maker. So we'll be working out different strategies, how to make up for the loss of out of home consumption. There will be some changes around product per se, in terms of different variants, in terms of different mixes. So just to give you a brief example that globally the Starbucks alliance which we did last year, the bigger one. So that is one of the business which we see that is doing very well during this pandemic, because that was mostly for the branded products. So taking learning from such examples, we will be working out both on the back end of the business as well as on the front end of the business to mitigate these losses. And I am pretty much hopeful that the kind of resilience we have seen, and we are prepared for better numbers next year.
Mr. Kumar, you did mention that there's a 10-15% decline when you look at out of home consumption. But have you in any sense leveled the in-house consumption? Has that given you better returns?
Yes, certainly in the month of April, I would say that the pantry stocking helped a lot to mitigate that. But there is a flattening towards when we reached June. But the numbers, the bottom up numbers we are seeing, because right now there is a lot of, I would say, uncertainties. Certainly, a particular city is getting into lockdown. So these numbers we are seeing flip flop month over month sometimes. So I would say it will take at least 1 quarter more to have a consistent trend to say that yes, we see that this much quarter on quarter. But yes, we are seeing green shoots, I would say that, and we'll be able to mitigate that loss.
Mr. Kaul, this one is to you. While we are talking numbers here, and I really hope I'm not, throwing dark darts here. But what is the kind of loss that this sector has seen? Because there are numbers that all sectors are now putting out on how the previous quarter has been for various sectors. So when it comes as coffee as a place, which actually hasn't been doing so well as an industry because of the price decline, because of higher production, because of increase in cost of production as well, what numbers are we putting here?
So from a so purely from a demand perspective, like Mukesh was mentioning, we have seen also from a green coffee perspective a spike in demand in the months of March and April, which was basically a follow-up of the demand spike that was seen in the retail segment. So therefore, wherever there was a very large exposure to the retail market, we did see a spike in demand. That demand has started to taper off now as we finished June and got into July. But if you look at where we were at the end of June last year versus where we are today, we still believe that on an overall basis, global demand or global consumption has not declined.
Okay.
And our forecast for the end of the year, based on the projections that we are making, is that definitely the growth for this year is out of question. But we could see the world maintaining the demand and consumption of coffee at least at the levels at which it was last year, or maybe having a very, very small decline over that. But these are all projections. They are based on a given point of time, and the way things are turning out in many countries now with the resurgence of of the infections and talks about a second and then a third wave coming and possibly more lockdowns happening in various parts of the world. All these are very dynamic and could change from month on month. But at where we stand today, we don't see a very large drop in consumption from where we were last.
Mr. Pant, this one is to you, and we do understand that I get it. It's difficult to really look too forward here from where we stand right now. But we're all talking about on how we are changing our game here, and I do want to get in digitization, innovation, e-commerce into the conversation on how are you guys making use of that?
So we are largely an international business, and on the international front today, the emphasis is largely on a new world order. The international trade is not going to be the same again after what you've seen in the past, past 3 months and perhaps past 2 years, 3 years. But there's a lot of work that we are doing internally in India as a company on. In fact, it had started before the pandemic, both on Tata Consumer side as well as from our side in terms of e-commerce and leveraging this whole experience demand, as we call it. Demand for good quality coffees delivered directly to your home. I'm not sure if you've looked at this brand called Sonnets. You could probably, since you mentioned it, you can go to the net and see. These are some of our finest estate coffees, and it's a path-breaking development in India, where we are roasting some of our finest estate coffees, and we are delivering it at your residence through an e-commerce portal. Now, this is something that we had actually initiated before the pandemic. And really, as we see, I mentioned it earlier, as well as on one hand, while you see instant coffee growing, but also this whole movement towards experiential coffees in India is gathering a lot of momentum. And I think with Tata Coffee, with its own assets on land and plantations, is very well poised to sort of leverage this. So I think that's a path-breaking thing that we've started off with, and I would urge all of this is not a marketing pitch, but all of the participants here could perhaps go to the web and see. And I promise Deepak that I can send him a parcel from India to Singapore because it's only available in India. But I think that's something really we are extremely proud about as a company, and we believe that we are able to sort of convey this whole experience of coffee directly to you guys.
I was just about to say that I might just come up with Singapore and pick it up, but that doesn't seem very likely in the near future.
Oh, but we're all in India. All right. So, Mr. Kaul, this one is to you. So, while of course we will continue to talk micro here, but we have seen a lot of international cues, as to say, also impact businesses and prices and consumption, etc. So, whether we spoke about currencies already, you spoke about Brazilian real, all of you, because that is directly correlated to where the coffee prices could be headed. But with the kind of stimulus measures that we're looking at, with more money availability, more startups coming in, more small businesses perhaps starting up as well. And then there is the whole US and China thing. China is one of the major consumers as well, as you just pointed out. And then the US presidential election. So the world is really going through a lot and will continue to do so for the rest of this year. What is your sense on how will all of this macro impact this sector?
This is a bit of a tough one because the more variables you add onto a very simple thing like a coffee price, the more complicated you make your own life. So purely from a macro perspective, we already know that there is a significant amount of fund participation in coffee. The fund participation largely over the years has transitioned from being discretionary people-led funds to more machine-led funds, and therefore the percentage or the participation level of algorithmic funds or black box funds as they are called has really increased, and they are purely trend-following funds, and therefore their ability to invest in coffee will be a function of various things that go on in the macro environment, and therefore whether they are short coffee or long coffee will depend on what their algorithms are telling them. And therefore, it's true that there is a lot of liquidity available in the markets with Feds and other central banks printing unlimited amounts of cash. And all of that cash has to find home somewhere and has to sort of run behind yield. And where we are today, commodities do offer a certain amount of yield depending on how you posture your positions on those markets. But what you are seeing in equity markets is a pure example of a lot of money chasing fewer assets which can provide yield today, because the value of money has sort of disappeared with interest rates completely collapsing, with unlimited quantitative easing by most federal governments. So therefore, we do believe that there is going to be increasing liquidity and increasing interest in various asset classes, and agricultural commodities in general and coffee in particular will have an impact. But what side of the spectrum that impact will come will largely depend on of course fundamental supply and demand economics, but also in terms of the participants and how they are positioned in terms of their own trading strategies and how they are willing to invest. I hope I'm answering. I have answered your question.
You have, Mr. Call, and I do get it, because most of these commodities, the global commodities, are driven by funds as well, and clearly this one hasn't caught their fancy for some time now, for obvious reasons. But I was just asking because there is just so much liquidity, and almost everything seems to be running up because of the kind of money that is ready to be deployed. But Mr. Pant, this one is to you. So what is the new normal now? We understand.
Just to sort of clarify, before you go ahead, liquidity could also mean that the funds are short coffee. That's also an investment. Therefore, the coffee prices will continue to go down, but the funds have made an investment and they are looking for the return on that investment. So therefore, it is a little bit counterintuitive, but investment is not only about buying things; it also could be selling things ahead of time.
Oh well, yes, and people have made killing doing that as well. Absolutely get your point on that. Yeah, this one is to you, Mr. Pant. So what is the new normal now? I mean, I understand we are into a difficult situation here, and as all of you have said, that this is, the outlook may perhaps change month on month depending on what kind of numbers are we seeing on virus, whether a vaccine comes on, more stimulus measures coming in, and the kind of demand that people are looking at, because we're not looking at very healthy numbers when you look at the job numbers or the increment numbers for that matter. So what is the new normal for this sector going forward?
So I think few things. It's difficult to define, Manisha, a new normal, but I think what we believe, 3 or 4 things which we'll see play out over the next perhaps 1 year. One is, as I said earlier, and I cannot overstate this, I think the international trade is going to be recalibrated, whether it's coffee or any other agricultural commodity. I think there have been far too many disruptions and things which we never expected, which would have happened even 2 years ago. So I think a lot of the structure of the trade is going to be recalibrated. It's going to be reassessed, and the traditional buyers and sellers, the relationships of comfort, which were there for the past perhaps 10, 20 years, will all be tested now. And I think the way India positions itself in this crossroads that it is finding itself into right now is going to be very critical, as I said, for the next 5, 10 years, if you look at the coffee journey. So I think we have to be very cognizant that there is going to be a recalibration of international trade, because coffee is $1 billion business. Coffee exports is $1 billion for India annually in exports, close to $1 billion. So it's not small money, right? And I think we have to be extremely sensitive to these winds of change. 2 or 3 other things which we believe. One is, of course, this whole nutrition wellness thing will just gather more momentum now. There's no denying the fact. I mean, across the world, we will see a much stronger sort of demand for things which are centered around safety, hygiene, environment, wellness. These things are not going to give ground at all. And pandemic or no pandemic, in the sense, they're already on an upswing. Despite the fact that there will be pockets which will be hurt, but I do not foresee that this is going to be backtracked now. These things will only go up. And if you ask me one more thing, surely it's going to be innovation. From our side, I think people are going to be willing to pay you extra dollars across the world if they see some value which is beyond the usual cost. cost reduction stuff. So as I mentioned, the days of India being competitive because we were just lower cost producers and getting entry quickly into a few countries because there was traditional trade flow is all gone. We have to look at a recalibration of trade flows. We have to look at the fact that, there will be increased demand on wellness, nutrition, safety. And if you ask me, as I said, product innovation and just understanding a superior understanding of this whole coffee applications game.
Well, absolutely, I get your point. This one is to you, Mr. Rajiv Mohan. We've spoken about the concerns in the sector, and there's so much uncertainty here. But all of you are rooting for consumption growth, innovation, and of course, adding premium, even if it is, there are takers for that clearly. But what kind of a government reforms have you seen? Are you looking at? I mean, I keep reading the coffee board reports on what all they keep asking from the government. But what is the sense? Because you've said in your presentation that you really need to rally behind the farmers, and we do understand that even after government and all that it is done on ground, we've seen not too many results being yielded there. So, what is your sense when it comes to the policy or the reform side of this?
Yeah, I think I would stick to the three areas which I largely covered in my presentation. I think where we need to really focus is put in a lot of R&D into kind of rejuvenating our plantations and basically developing, pest and disease resistant varieties so that our productivity levels go up. I think that needs to be the topmost focus, because if we really want to look at market growth either in exports or in domestic market, I think we need to create a very solid supply base. And where the government also needs to help on the production side is where people are actually doing work either in areas of organic or certified coffees. Because if you really want to develop the specialism of Indian coffee, you need to incentivize those areas where the specialism is coming up. The next thing is the entire supply chain. I think whether it is at the farm level or at the the manufacturer or the exporter level, I think the whole thing we need to relook at it in terms of how we kind of digitize and automate the systems and processes so that, we're actually seeing now, for example, that earlier what you thought you would courier your documents is now something where you do an e-transmission is kind of taken for granted that you will do it. It's been an entire paradigm shift in the way you handled your documentation process itself. So I think these things would be the new normal, and you need to look at innovative ways of either automating or modernizing your entire supply chain. And the final thing is that how we take the government's help to promote exports, develop markets, have country to country arrangements, because ultimately when you trade, it's not just companies but also it is government to government. So what kind of an arrangement would you have in terms of either in terms of tariffs or in terms of treaties with various regional blocs, and also developing our own domestic market, because I think that in terms of consumption for the size of market which we have, it's hardly anything. So how do we promote domestic consumption? So these would be the three large areas where I think the government policies need to be fine-tuned with the help of Coffee Board, on the production side, on the supply chain side, and on the marketing side.
So I actually want to simplify this Q&A now, and I want to come to each of you. I have a ABCD in sense of questions here, and since I have you with me, Mr. Rajiv Mohan, let's start with you itself. So more like a winding down comments. When you look at this sector, what is the opportunity? What is the challenge? What is your sense on demand, supply numbers going forward, and how do you look at the prices? So I know I've actually broken it down to 5 questions here, but if you could address it one by one.
See, the thing is that I would answer it more from a exporter perspective, and I would exporter of green coffee perspective, and then say that definitely there are a lot of issues in the environment which are currently playing into the supply and demand dynamics. But going forward, we definitely see that there is a huge opportunity for India as far as the coffee arena is concerned, and we feel that should we get our act right and on time, there is definitely large scope for India to kind of increase the exports of coffee going forward, not just to the traditional markets, but also looking at newer markets as we go along. And of course, like everybody has mentioned, there is this huge opportunity in the domestic market. So I think the more we offer of products which kind of harp on convenience, which are packaged, which are accessible, I think there will also be a growth in the domestic market. So I think that there's always an opportunity to turn this black swan event into a white swan if we, kind of put all our points and all our actions together.
Mr. Pant, same question to you. What do you see as an opportunity, challenge? What would you look out for now in the market as the next step that this sector needs to grab with both hands? And also your sense on the demand, supply, prices going forward.
Yeah, I think I would again reiterate that this sector is very, very rewarding as far as exports are concerned. It's close to 6,000 crores today. So I think it will lend itself going forward to a mix of both export opportunity as well as domestic opportunity. I think the play on domestic has only begun, with India rapidly shifting in certain parts from a tea drinking country to a country which appreciates coffee. So I think it requires a finesse. It requires an understanding of both the dimensions. It's very important on exports to understand and as I've mentioned, you will see a lot of opportunities emerge and a lot of recalibration in the whole international trade space in the coming 5 to 10 years. So I think we have to be, as a country, on top of it. Again, domestic opportunity is something that is only sort of emerging now. So a very nuanced understanding of both these portfolios is critical. I would perhaps also say that, and I think Deepak mentioned it earlier, we've had 3 very rough years in terms of coffee prices, and nobody really likes it. Many people feel that the roasters like it, but I'm sure everyone in the coffee industry today is quite, sort of pained by the coffee prices over the last 3 years. And I think he rightly said the coffee prices are below cost of production at most of the origins, except 1 or maybe 2 across the world. So I think it's time. We are looking at perhaps, at some point of time, this run that we've had, and which is very cyclical in nature, to reverse itself. And I think all of us, with bated breath, are looking at markets to take a bit of a turnaround and give us a sense of relief for this industry. So clearly, yes, I think we do expect the market, which are at this stage, to reverse and bring hope and cheer to the farming community across the world. One is in India, of course, across the world, who've been perhaps the worst hit out of this run of poor prices.
Also, Mr. Pant, would you say there is perhaps more branding, more awareness to be created? I mean, I understand. I mean, you and me follow coffee. You perhaps talk the coffee language, but most of the people do not even understand Robusta or, the brands for that matter also. So do you think when it comes to coffee, creating an awareness like perhaps the tea guys do or the other producers do, that perhaps needs to be done as well?
Yeah, you need a domestic movement. I mean, we've been saying it for far too long now. And I think there are countries, everybody knows about Brazil. Brazil is a standout example. I mean, they really, today, if Brazil is the second largest consumer in the world, it's not by chance. It's because they've worked on, painstakingly on developing coffee consumption in their country. So there needs to be a program. I mean, it will be rather unfair for me to say that Coffee Board needs to drive this. I mean, there is a limit to things it can drive. I think it is for all stakeholders, whether it's people like you, people like the coffee companies, the state governments. It has to be a joint effort. But it's time that I think this is a gem which is we keep saying, which is waiting to be completely sort of explored. So there is an opportunity which I think is a joint sort of burden on all of us to unravel and take it to this large landmass, to this large populace in this landmass, so that coffee consumption can really sort of fly off. It's been dormant far too long.
Call to you then, and the same set of questions really on what are your final comments? Where do you see an opportunity? Do you see this time that can be used as a game changer? Do you see things changing a lot from here on for the better? That is what we are hoping, but the graph could also go down.
Yeah. So I would like to address this question in 2 parts. The first part, essentially, and these 2 parts probably would be a little bit of a global idea, and then probably bringing it down to the local Indian context. I think on the global front, demand trends seem to be secular. And we do believe that demand will remain strong. And the other trends towards the shift of demand towards more premiumization, more higher end consumption, more gourmet consumption, I think those demands also will probably come back in terms of their prevalence, because we have seen over this last few months that, because of the shift away from out of home to back to in home, there has been a shift from, let's say, the more higher end gourmet coffees to the more, let's say, traditional brands and the retail type of coffee. So we do believe that those trends are largely intact. We really have to see what happens over the course of the next 6 to 12 months in order to really make an assessment on whether we need to change our mind or not. But making the assumption that those trends are intact, I think we will see coffee markets reacting, and therefore we will see that consumption will be back. On the global perspective, I think the key challenge for the world market is essentially this entire concentration of coffee in two large producing countries, and I think that's not really healthy for the coffee market, and therefore the other countries need to pull up their socks in terms of ensuring that they have their rightful share in the global coffee marketplace. Now coming to India, I think India is at a unique place in world coffee because of two reasons. One, it has the potential of producing very high-end coffees which are on trend and on the current, demand of coffee in terms of higher end gourmet coffee. So that's one. The second thing is India as a producer has the luxury of a rich tradition of coffee behind it. Although, like Amit was mentioning, that the local consumption is like a dominant lion which just needs to roar. But in terms of the coffee culture and the production culture in India and the research that is available in India and the know-how in terms of coffee growing that's available in India, that's really immense. And if we were to really sprinkle that with some amount of research and new techniques in terms of growing and improving productivity, I think India stands at the cusp of an explosion in terms of productivity and production of coffee. Of course, that will really mean investment in farms, investment in technology, investment in good agricultural practices, and of course, a lot of that also revolves around rejuvenation of farms. And it's a little bit of a cycle because the farmers need to be able to generate those amounts of cash for them to be able to then invest it back into their farm. So the coffee prices will have to play a significant part in ensuring that those investments are forthcoming. And at the end of it, I think in the short term, because of what we have seen, the pandemic response, because of the way our industry is structured and the sector is structured with so much of fragmentation at all ends, at the production end, at the consumption end, and in the supply chain, I think it gets really left to the state to pick up the slack in terms of immediate response against challenges of the kind that we have faced in the last few months. And various countries have reacted differently, and I'm sad to say that not many countries have reacted positively towards the plight of the small grower, if that small grower were an economic entity. So that's probably it. I think India is sitting on the cusp of a very large opportunity in terms of sort of gaining its rightful share in the world coffee market, and I believe that it's not in too distant future that's going to happen.
Mr. Kumar, this one is to you. And when we look at coffee, like we do in case of many other commodities, how are you looking at geographies, or is there even a rural or urban divide here? This is in addition to all the other questions that you have to answer.
Yeah, thanks. So, from my perspective, as earlier panelists mentioned, that this is really a huge latent potential, I would say, that India is having. So, whenever I have a discussion with my brand team, that okay, guys, why don't we just do some advertisements around this particular origin of coffee and this? So they come back to me, and their challenge is, Mukesh, there are people in this country, and large majority of people who don't know that coffee is a plantation crop. It's not an annual crop. It doesn't get harvested. So when you are in a country that still that kind of knowledge gap in terms of coffee is there, you can imagine once we put our energy and efforts behind, what wonders we can do in terms of taking this consumption percentage of overall production. So that is one area where we will be working on, and we are working on drastically in new markets, new geographies. And another thing is that we do believe that this consumption story, the growth story of India is intact, and coffee market, coffee consumption is going to play along with that. Whether it's premiumization, whether it's niche coffee, whether it's along the learning curve, consumers will understand, and there will be a shift from other beverages. Now, opportunity perspective, I would say from a broader perspective, not for the homegrown consumption. Let's try to shift from a commodity mindset to a brand mindset, whether it's Indian origin, or whether a specialty coffee, or whatever differentiation if we can bring to the table, that will make sustain these price levels. So if we can sustain a 500 plus differentials in such kind of market, then we can imagine if we brand it properly, we do our homework around productivity, etc., around varieties. So there is a huge potential on that front from exports perspective. Now, I covered in my presentation that yes, when I visit sometimes different plantations, the small growers, as in most of the cases, because I do handle a lot of different commodities. So when I visit to a farmer, so the sad plight is that no planters wants their son to be a planter, or no farmers wants their son or a daughter to be a planter. So that's a real bigger question as a stakeholder, as an important stakeholder of this value chain. We have to emphasize that how to make this much more remunerative, much more profitable for everyone, and to the grower who is the starting point of this entire story. So if 10 years down the line we see there is a gap, then everything around that will collapse. So the entire ecosystem I briefly mentioned in our presentation also, and that's the global approach we are taking. That how pre-competitive uh, collaborations we can make with different companies, our competitions as well, no issue, because it's about industry. So how such kind of collaboration we can make, and we can make that coffee growing remains a uh, better proposition for the planter, that he doesn't try to sift it and sell it to some real estate or something else or some other businesses. So that is a bigger question which we should address. And last, which from a marketeer perspective, from a supply chain professional perspective, I see that a lot of innovation is waiting to happen in this space. I don't see much of innovation when I compare to a lot of other crops where different kinds of system on pricing, on contract farming, on farm traceability, on crop forecasting is happening. I find that link missing in coffee. So that is one innovation which I would be waiting for, and we are hopeful. And going in next 2 3 years, you will see that a lot of startups around these kind of concept growing closer to the planters, that visibility to the planters level, and how we can improve. Because in such situation, when I go to we as a company want to help that, okay, what we can do for this planters. So the first leg is that the visibility till the planters level, till a farmer level. So that is going to improve much more in coming years, particularly post this crisis which we face.
Mm. So, Mr. Kumar, also, since I've spoken to all of you, there is a lot of hope in the markets. Is it just that, or do you think the numbers do support this? Because when I speak to all of you, we do understand that there is issues at the plantation level, and then procuring the pricing. Also, when it comes to branding, marketing, imaging, all of there is a whole chain of concerns here. So going forward, when we talk about that the demand is going to increase, that we are looking at more growth here, more products perhaps would be introduced, etc. Do we actually see a market for that? Are there numbers supporting this?
So for us, definitely, I would say that we are working on a very encouraging pipeline, different themes around beverages with a base of coffee, and whether it's freeze dried or some new packs, because this COVID has also impacted on your pack sizes. So that is one. So those every moment, as I explained in my previous comment, that we will be working on both the back end as well as the front end. That how to build on these numbers.
Oh, well, absolutely. I can see my daughter from the corner of my eyes telling me to ask about cold coffee. So I do get that definitely
Sure.
there. So yes. So yes, and I do get it that instant coffee, brewed coffee, filter coffee, quick coffee, carry con coffee, bottled coffee, canned coffee, and cold coffee. Yes, I do understand that there's a definite demand for that.
Yeah, so
Uh,
just to add on that, recently I had a query from one of my brand guys that can we do something around immunity with coffee? So you never know.
Haldi coffee doesn't work. Definitely.
So so that's how we can see.
Well, we do look forward to all of that. And thank you so much. It really has been a very enriching conversation. With that, is back to you, Rohit.
Thank you, panelists, and thank you, ma'am, for this very interesting discussion. Before we end the session, I would like to thank our partners, NCDX and ONAM, for supporting this seminar series. Also, thank you, participants. Hope you found the session engaging and insightful. We will be sharing a quick feedback form with you over email. We request you to please drop in your feedback for us, and request you to also join us for our upcoming session in Surya. Thank you once again.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Much thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah.